afternoon, good evening, or wherever you are. I'm glad you're able to join us tonight at DevOps Live Meetup. My name is Mike Rosado. I'm going to be your host. And tonight we have a very interesting presentation and demo from Bruno Andrade. He is with Shippa, and he's going to be talking about deploying Kubernetes, securing it, and monitoring. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation. If you can, please post your questions, and as soon as we can, I'll go ahead and display them. And if if we need to interrupt, Bruno will do that, and so forth. But I also wanted to take a few moments to let everyone know, if you haven't joined us before, the DevOps Days Dallas was postponed from last year, and we had postponed it to this year, August of this year. We're hoping to have it in person, but we're still trying to find out the details between the venue and how we're going to be able to do it an in-person event. So stay tuned, monitor our Twitter, and also monitor the website. If you go to devopsdays.org, you'll see that there are a lot of DevOps Days events happening virtually. And especially, we're happy to announce that there's, if you haven't already kind of registered, there's a DevOps Days Texas happening next week on March 2nd and 3rd. And it's a combination of the different organizations from Dallas, Austin, and Houston that are putting this virtual event together. So it's going to be great. So go ahead, and a lot of great speakers. So go ahead and join us. Go to the devopsdays.org website, and you'll see the Texas state there drawn. Just click on it and register, okay? Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring on Bruno Andrade. I'm going to let him introduce himself a little bit here. Hold on a second. Hey, Bruno, thanks for joining us tonight. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Mike. I appreciate it.
Sounds great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and I've already kind of told everybody that, that you're from Shippa and what you're going to kind of be presenting, but go ahead and let everybody know a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, of course.
And then I'll load the presentation while you're doing that here.
No, sounds good. I appreciate it. So as Mike mentioned, I'm one of the founding members here at Shippa, and where we focus on the application management aspect when you're deploying applications and services on Kubernetes, right? Prior to Shippa, I had an opportunity to build another startup. I also focus on the kind of cloud native space, but more geared towards the infrastructure space itself. That organization was acquired by another company here in California, and that's how I actually moved to California. And but my background, I'm a computer engineer, and I spent many years basically doing sysadmin, right? I say that I was a sysadmin before we had the fancy titles of SREs, DevOps, and all these things when we're dealing with bare metal and VMs, and we had to do everything. So that's a little bit of a background about me.
Awesome. And you said you're in California right now, right?
I'm in California, and I'm originally from Brazil, a city called São Paulo. And I spent a few years in Canada as well before moving here.
Awesome. Well, let me go ahead and bring up the presentation real quick here, and then I'll just drop off and let you take over.
Awesome, sounds good. And as Mike mentioned, feel free to ask questions and stop me anytime. And the title of even though we're going to be talking about managing the apps, deploying and monitoring, as this is an interesting topic for a lot of folks that we talk to. But I like to drive it with the title of why Kubernetes will disappear and developers won't care. When I mentioned that, a lot of folks, they actually they don't like that topic too much. They find it controversial because Kubernetes is just starting. But stay with me, and you're going to understand what I mean by Kubernetes will disappear and developers won't care. The second slide was just talk a little bit about me, but I mentioned, and I think, as maybe you can see a little bit on the background, I love music. That was my original goal, to be a musician. Gladly or sadly, I realized that I was not good enough to cut it. So I had to change gears, and I went into engineering. But yeah, if you're out there and you want to jam and build something, just send me a message. Would love to do it. And I love pizza as well, and I don't really like complicated things. That's part of why I started Cheapo, right? Let's try to uncomplicate things. You can find me on Twitter under BR Andrade TO. The TO comes from Toronto. That's where I used to live for a couple of years ago. So feel free to ping me on Twitter as well. And talking about Kubernetes itself, I think we have this image, and maybe some of you have seen that. And I think that kind of brings a little bit of context on what I mean by why Kubernetes will disappear and your developers, they won't care. If we follow the chart, basically it says, hey, it follows a scenario where in your company or in your kind of friend network, everyone is talking about Kubernetes, and it looks awesome. That's the direction where everyone is going today. And our common reaction is always to, well, I can't wait to get my apps deployed on Kubernetes, right? It looks great. Can I do it? And the funny thing is, when you start asking that question, the first response is like, yeah, it's awesome. And you get a bunch of stuff for free that you had to build before, such as health checks, scheduling, scaling, service discovery. So you got all of that for free. So you definitely should move that direction. And that's what a lot of us, we're hearing, right? And this sounds great. So our first reaction is we spin up a cluster, either micro K8s, K3s, kind, Minikube, or whatever. We give it a start, we deploy, and we start diving in, right? We deploy our first hello world, and that's easy enough. I can keep using this thing. But as we start going deeper in, we start realizing that deploying our applications is not just the hello world. We have to understand deployment, services are back, and that's the waiting time, right? And that's when we understand this is not what I expected. And that's both on the developer side and on the DevOps side. And if we try to bring that to our reality, and don't worry, we're going to jump into the demo soon. But just to give a little bit of context, I promise I won't bore you to death with the slides. If we bring it to our reality today, right? Let's say, hey, I'm a developer or a DevOps person, and I have a toolkit website, let's say, and I need to deploy this thing to Kubernetes. And I'll maybe use Helm because everyone says it's easy, right? And we know how it works, right? We don't need to create a Helmchart from the beginning, from scratch. We copy it from someone. So for whoever is here today and has not heard about Helmchart, Helmchart is a package manager for your applications to be deployed on Kubernetes. So we usually just clone this thing. We fork, we copy from someone, and we have it. And we look at the structure. I'm like, well, okay. I have two files there. One is called chart YAML. The other one is values YAML. If I check the first one, chart YAML, well, I have a description, I have name, and I have version. Okay, I'm smart enough to do that. I can update these three fields. When I look into the values, okay, things start to get a little bit more complicated, right? I can understand maybe the first one is my image ID or address. But what is an ingress, right? And should I enable it or disable resource limits? I don't understand how much I should put. So what actually happens is your developers and DevOps teams many times just put the maximum amount they can. And then you start going deeper and you're like, well, what's rollout? What is Istio? Is it analysis? Should I enable or disable? Well, let's say you fight through it, you complete it. Now let's go into the templates folder so I can get my app deployed. And then you see yourself with the bunch of YAMLs file. And when you go towards the first one, and keep in mind, we're trying to deploy a website. We're not talking about complicated and complex services, a bunch of network policies and all. We're trying to deploy a website. When we go into the deployment file, seems logical, we're trying to deploy, and then you start seeing what is container port, what is liveness probe, what is readiness probe, what is the period second that I should put in here, what is match label selector for my pods. And you start moving actually from being that happy developer or DevOps into basically this guy, right? And the question you ask yourself is, why the heck did I do that? And why did I get myself into this? And then you start fighting through these things. What is an Istio YAML file? How do I create an endpoint for my application? What is a service, right? And how do I get this thing? And even when you go nuts about it, creating all these things for your single website, and you finally deploy this, what happens is you basically end up with this, right? When before we were used to dealing with application level context, Kubernetes now is very object context. So now you have to deal with your application code. You have to learn now a bunch of Terraform because you have to automate Helmchart creation, object creation, Helm apply, and others in your cluster. You have to learn Helm, and you end up with a bunch of living objects in your cluster that does not relate at an app level, does not have kind of clear ownership of who owns what. And maybe if you're deploying 5, 10, or a few services, that's okay, it's manageable. But as you start getting into the dozens or hundreds scale, then it becomes a nightmare, right? Because the development and deployment, it becomes really complex. You're going to see your developers complaining a lot, saying that they're spending a lot of time on object and they don't really understand and they shouldn't spend time on doing that. And it's a fair assumption, right? Because that's not their background. Their background is not infrastructure. Kubernetes kind of blur those lines on who does what, right? The roles and responsibilities. And because of that, it creates, I'm sure many of you here on this presentation today, you've seen misconfigured objects being created. Even if you give Helmchart templates, even if you give stuff for people to copy and to take as a base, they just have to enter values. Because they don't essentially know what's happening, the possibility of creating misconfigured objects, it's just real, it happens. And supporting the application post-deployment is just another nightmare. And we say this, again, as I mentioned before, this is a lack of application context, right? And we see that debate between DevOps and developers quite a bit. And I'm sure all of you, or most of you have heard that as well, where we see a lot of the DevOps folks saying, but developers should learn Kubernetes, right? And I don't disagree, I agree. And learning is awesome, and you should definitely learn as much as you can. But when talking to one of our users, it was interesting because we brought up that that conversation, and one of the DevOps guys actually said something that makes sense. A lot of DevOps, we as a DevOps team, we go back to the developer and say, you have to learn this. But then one of the developers went back and said, well, okay, but do you read a Java book in your free time? And reality is nobody does that, right? Well, almost nobody, maybe I should say. So developers, they really want to be focused on their application code, and DevOps wants to focus on the components that will serve the developer to be able to deploy those apps. And what we're seeing is, and you're going to find people in different parts of their journey with Kubernetes. Some are at the very beginning, some are very late stage, but as part of Sheepa, my role, I talk to a lot of the users out there, right? And even though we talk a lot about Kubernetes, we see that a lot of the enterprises, they are just starting their journey. Kubernetes is very used at scale, mostly on internet companies or cloud forward companies, as I call them sometimes. But on the traditional enterprise, I would say most of them are just starting. Even though you might see CNCF stuff saying 80% of the enterprises have adopted Kubernetes, they're not wrong, they're right. But when they say enterprises are adopting Kubernetes, a lot of them have just deployed their first few services. So they're just getting started and just understanding how this all works, right? And as they get started, one of the things they realize is that Kubernetes is not the best interface for my users. So we got to put something in between my developers and my Kubernetes instance in a way that developers can use Git, CI pipeline, terminal, or whatever they want, but they can get their applications deployed without having to worry about Kubernetes, and in a way that they can look and understand what they're doing, right? So that's kind of what most people are looking for these days. And when they start trying to get started, the first thing they look at is kind of the CNCF landscape, which, my friend, this is gonna drive you nuts, right? Today, I think there's 1,000 plus or something like that of vendors and solutions out there, very segregated, and it becomes really, this is great and it's awesome to see the ecosystem growing, but from a DevOps team, it can drive you crazy, right? To know what to adopt. And if you don't know the right tools, this can just drive complexity, more complexity, and more frustration with your developers and DevOps teams. But some of the tools that we see out there that people are mostly using is they've been trying to use Terraform a lot to try and automate a lot of the tasks, like generate Helm charts, creating Helm charts, deploying stuff. There's a popular tool now called Argo as well, where there is wide adoption, and it is focused on the deployment side of the house. We see a lot of in-house development tools, which is great, but we see most enterprises, they actually get into that, saying we're going to develop our own tools, but then later they abandon the idea because developing something and maintaining it at scale is a full-time product job, right? And most enterprises, when they realize that, they don't want to spend that time and resources. And other tools that I'm directly related to is Sheepa, which is the product I'm part of. And there is Catch, which is open source, and it's also part of the deployment. And that's it on slides. Now I'm going to show you a little bit of kind of the options, right? When we're looking at deploying and controlling Kubernetes and applications deployments, as mentioned, you have these as some of the options: Terraform, Argo, and others. But since I have a Sheepa instance, I'm going to use one as an example of the end goal, right? That maybe you can look at trying to achieve when you're building this for your users. If I change this, let me just move here. Sorry, too much technology these days. Yes, I guess you guys can see this. So what I have in front of me is basically my GitHub for Catch, and I'll have the link for Catch, and not only Catch, but Sheepa, Argo, Terraform. And again, even though I'm gonna talk a little bit about Sheepa and Catch, you should evaluate what's best for your organization. And if Terraform is better, or if Argo is better, in-house is better, stick to it, right? Build what's best for you. And I say focus on the application and your team's requirements, and then technology will just follow suit. But if we start looking at Sheepa, right? Sheepa is basically the way we DevOps, or we at Sheepa, think of how DevOps wants to deliver the application layer to your users, right? So one thing, we as DevOps, we want to ensure governance and controls are applied and security are applied to everything our developers deploy. That's point one. And point two of our deliverables, we want to make sure that developers can focus on what matters to them, which is basically application delivery and application management, no infrastructure. So I think those are the two kind of premises that we should always pay attention to in this case. When we DevOps team, we log into Shippa, the first thing we do is usually we create something called frameworks. These frameworks, they allow you to set up boundaries and guardrails on what's going to be delivered. And what I mean by that is you can deliver your frameworks, either create your frameworks directly from the dashboard or from the CLI. If you do it from the CLI, for example, let me open one here. I hope you guys can see this. If you can't, just let me know in the comments, and I can make the letters bigger. But I'm deploying a framework, right? And a framework is basically the controls and guardrails that you want to apply. And these are at the application level, not the cluster level. So when you think of it, you think of what I want my applications to do, or how do I want to control and enforce my apps. So the first few things you're going to see here is like plan. So how much memory and CPU applications deployed using this framework can consume, right? The second point is security. So what level of security scans do I want to execute when applications are being deployed? Code level or platform layer level, or none of them. And if you want to ignore some vulnerabilities, you can give it access to a few teams. So which teams can use this framework to do the deployment, which external services people can tie here. So every app deployed using this framework can access to RDS, for example, or Mongo. How many apps can be deployed, and so on and so forth. Once this is created, you can just say Shippa framework add, and then the name of the file. And we did it in a file format because you can put it into your Git repo. And your Git repo can basically be executed from your CI, and these frameworks can be created directly from your CI. Well, let's say once it's created and I gave access to a certain team. Now I can come in here and tie that framework to a cluster. And the cluster can be AKS, GKE, or your own premises Kubernetes, right? Again, you're building boundaries and controls into that framework, and you're tying that framework to a cluster. Once this is all done, those two steps are done, your developers, they can come in here, and now they can start creating their applications. They can create and deploy their applications from dashboard, or they can create and deploy their applications from CI pipeline, for example. But a quick example is if we use our terminal, and let's say I have a Ruby sample application. I'm wearing my developer hat now. I know nothing about Kubernetes. I just got access to this Shippa thing, and I want to have my app deployed, right? How do I get that stuff in there? So the first thing the developer is going to do is Shippa app create, and he's going to say the name of the app, for example. He's going to say it's a Ruby app, in this case. The team that is the owner, and the framework that you gave him access to deploy, right? So then remember, this framework is tied to or bound to a Kubernetes cluster. There's already one. Okay. DevOps demo. New. Created. If we go back into here, we can see the application is already created. And what I'm showing you guys, it's available Git free. You can install it in your cluster. I'll go through that. But you can see it here as idle. If I go inside, I can see it created an endpoint for my app. There's nothing right there now, and it's idle because me as developer, I haven't created anything or deployed anything yet. I just created that app as a shell. And here I have my Ruby app. I have no Kubernetes objects, deployment sets, ingress service. I have no Helm templates or nothing. I don't know anything about that, right? So what I'm going to do is Shipa app deploy. I'm going to deploy to DevOps demo new. I think that was the name. That's it. Yes. And I'm going to deploy these files locally, right? That's it. Then there's not even a Docker file in here. So if you want to skip that, you can do. Your developers, they don't even need to. Your developers don't even need to build the Docker file if they don't want, but they can deploy as well a Docker file if they want. So while this is being deployed, let's get to an app that is deployed already. I have a booking service app. The way Shipa has a structure that is once the app is deployed, your developers, they can see who owns the service, because many times we as DevOps, we get a call and we say, the service has a problem and we don't know who owns the service, who we can contact within the teams and get help. So at least you can get some insights here. You can see the plan or limits that are attached to this app and so on. And then from here, right now, there's no access to this app, but you can see, you can understand how to monitor your application. So status codes, requests per second, response time. So both we as DevOps and our developers, they can understand what's happening to the apps. They can understand how much resources it's consuming. If we're using a multi-regional cluster, we can see where the apps are distributed. We can see who did what to the application, when it was created, when deployments happened, scaled up or down. We can see security scans. We can integrate the application into our incident management tools. And we can create network policies, for example. So it all becomes really visible to both us DevOps and our users. And I hope that makes sense. And if it doesn't, if it's not, if it doesn't, let me know in the comments. If it does, let me know in the comments as well. Even if there are questions about it or how to do certain things. And one of the things that we try to build as well to give users visibility is because we hear a lot that, okay, my app is deployed, but what is my app in the cluster, right? And if we use this, we can see basically, here's my app. And here's everything that belongs to my app, all the objects that belongs to my application that are in the cluster, such as secrets, pods, ingress entries, and the details. Is that helpful? So we always like to see what people think, and if that is kind of the helpful view to understand your application. And you can see further, right? How your ingress is structured, your network policy, both from an ingress and egress perspective. So you can see these available. So these are some of the things that we as DevOps, we can implement some controls and give these controls to our developers in a way that they focus just on the application code deployment. They don't have to understand Kubernetes, but we as DevOps, we are still in control, right? We can choose if we're using AKS cluster, GKE cluster, on-premises. Thanks, Mike. The front end, overall, the team does a really good job on this, but the front end really mastered this thing. We love it as well. But here we give it to our users, right? If you want to move into kind of more of a pure open source option to just want to get my applications deployed, right? I don't need the visibility, the maps, and all that. I just want to get my applications deployed on Kubernetes. So I get my users out of the kind of the whole scenario that we showed in the presentation before, right? When you dive deep and then you start running into these problems. The option is to use, another option we use is called Catch. And Catch is KETCH. You can access the website on thecatch.io, or it's under Catch on GitHub as well. If we want to give it a quick try, right? Let me see. I don't think I have Kubernetes cluster here. Let me get one connected. Great. Okay. Now we have a cluster. So I have my application. I have my container. How do I deploy this thing into Kubernetes, right? If we follow the basic kind of getting started documentation, and again, if you're watching this and if you want to contribute to a project, we would love to see you contributing to this and helping build this further. But let's follow the documentation. First, we install the CLI. Great, it is installed. We're going to install Cert Manager. So if we want to deploy applications and add a CNAME to that application so it can be reached through HTTPS or another CNAME, for example, we're going to install that. We're going to see that the process is very easy. And thanks for the comment, Ilya. That was exactly like me as well, going through this thing. And at the beginning, I was like, why do people want to use Kubernetes, right? And I see the point, but I still think it's a very complicated thing. I think I still have that face many times, actually. Okay, Cert Manager is installed. I'm going to install, assuming my cluster has no ingress controller, which in my case it doesn't, because it's just a brand new cluster empty. I'm going to install Istio as the ingress. If I can copy. All right, it's downloading and installed Istio. Now I just create this profile for Istio. And if anything that I'm saying doesn't make sense, feel free to put it in the comments or let me know. But yeah, we hear that a lot, actually. That's the end goal, right? And so yeah, I mean, and that's the end goal for many companies that we talk to and teams. But it would be interesting to hear your thoughts. Like, have you achieved that complete kind of hiding Kubernetes from them, or not yet? Is the Kubernetes adoption kind of hurting the developer productivity or experience? Because I think that's one of the things that people are talking a lot. But I think your goal is right, Ilya. I think that's the direction things should go. And the comparison I make is when you deploy an application to EC2, for example, 90% of the time, you probably don't really care if EC2, like AWS, is running Hyper-V or Zen. You don't care the processor that it's running or the kernel parameters. So I think with Kubernetes, you're completely right. We should get at that level as well, that we're just deploying apps. Really, it doesn't really matter the type of cluster version and so on that we're using underneath. So I'm totally in agreement with you there, that's the direction. The other part I'm going to install is basically the cluster issuer, which is to help us generate the certs. I think I have that file here. kubectl apply cluster issuer for Istio. Great. And last but not least, I'm going to install my catch controller. So what we did here, we had a Kubernetes cluster. We installed an ingress controller. We installed cert manager. And now we install catch as a controller, right? And that, good question. What I'm using is actually GKE, but you can do the same on EKS, which sits on AWS. That's right. They can break QA and send their code to production in peace. I don't know if there is ever code in production in peace, my friend. I think that's what we strive for, but I don't know if we can ever get that 24/7, but hopefully one day. So what we're doing now, we're going to create our apps, right? We're going to create an app. Let's say the first thing is create a pool, which follows the same framework concept as Shipa. And within that pool, we're going to pass the ingress endpoint. And the ingress endpoint is so catch can assign an endpoint for our application. So if I do catch pool add dev, and then I'll have to pass the ingress service endpoint and so on for me to get that, because I don't know that from top of my head. In my case, this is the one. So let's copy that again. And then ingress endpoint, type Istio. And I'm going to copy this IP. Oh, yeah. Me too, my friend. And I think that's why we try to kind of create some products before and today. And even though I say I hope this is my last startup, because I want to keep married. But yeah, I always try to help out and try to build that on the optimist side of the house. But I agree with you. So we created a pool using catch, right? And if we do a list, we're going to see dev. And the pool is basically a namespace in your cluster. If you do kubectl get namespace, we're going to see one called catch dev. So that's what we just created. Now, how do I get an application on this thing? We're going to create an application called bulletin board. Let's say I already have my Docker image for that. So we do a catch app create bulletin board, and I'm going to point to that namespace dev that we just created. Great. If we do catch app list, for example, we can see it is in state created because I haven't deployed anything, and catch already even assigned an address for us. So the last step here is to deploy the app. So we can do a catch app deploy bulletin board, which is the name of the app, and the address of my image. And that's it. If we do a catch app list, for example, we're going to see it's in deployment status, and soon it's going to be changing to running. So me as a developer or a DevOps, I have deployed my container, and I don't know anything about Kubernetes, right? I just make my life easier. Or as one of these days we saw someone saying Kubernetes in easy mode, right? There are a bunch of cheesy jokes, my friend, from the good ones all the way to the bad ones that you can probably go on Kubernetes, the complexity and the pain that sometimes it brings. But that's it from my side, from a presentation. And you can find these repos all available from, again, not only Shipa, but Shipa and Catch and Terraform and Argo. And again, you should focus on what is best for your application and team. But I agree with Ilya. The goal is let's build in a way that our developers can focus on deploying their apps and being able to manage their apps. And we as DevOps / SREs / sysadmins for the older folks in the room, we can focus on controls and choosing the pieces underneath that make sense to our application, right? So that was it on my side, Mike. I hope that was insightful to some folks in the room today.
Hey, thank you, Bruno. Yeah, I think it was very insightful. But let's see if there's anybody that may have any additional questions. Feel free to ask away if any questions regarding to Kubernetes, monitoring, deploying, security, anything that's burning desires in your heads.
I think the burning desire would probably be to get rid of this thing, right? And just to have something easy to.
Yeah, I hear you. Let's give it a few minutes here.
Just to add on that topic, I think from a monitoring perspective, the metrics that you saw coming in are using Prometheus on the background. I think that's one of the tools that most folks are using today. Yeah. And security is actually using Claire for security scans, but you can plug in other security scans as well as you desire. Yep. Thank you, folks, for the review and for the comments. I appreciate it.
For future, yeah. Let me check here. Hold on a second. Somebody's asking about this.
Oh, why is Kubernetes going away? Good point. So to close on the topic, right? It's not that Kubernetes is going to go away at the end. It's Kubernetes is going to go away from your users, right? Your end users. Like Ilya mentioned, our goal at the end is to allow our users to deploy their apps and manage without being bogged down into having to see Kubernetes, manage objects and infrastructure. Again, same way we do on AWS, right? When we deploy our apps, we're not looking at Xen, KVM, kernel parameters, and these things are all, I would say, invisible to us as end users. So for Kubernetes, I think to win in the space and in the market, that's the approach that most people are taking, and we hope, including us at Chipa, and we hope to succeed in a way that we use Kubernetes as a technology just to get where we need, but not as the end game that people are stuck into that, right? So that's, at the end, that's what I mean by Kubernetes should disappear.
Gotcha. So just curious, who are your competitors in this?
The most interesting thing is, I would say the biggest competitor is in-house tools, because I think Kubernetes is so new that we see the tendency of a lot of people trying to build these abstractions on top of Kubernetes, and they are all great, but enterprises, if you see banks and others, it's hard for them to invest on a lot of people to build a product on top of Kubernetes because that's just not their core business. But I would say by far the biggest competitor is in-house tools.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And I saw a question when you mentioned security groups. Yep, that one. The security groups are, because you are abstracting kubectl from your developers, Shipa is managing the groups for you. So if we do this, for example, if
over there.
Oh,
go ahead.
There you go. Thank you. If we do Shipa permission list, for example, you have a very, very detailed permission list in our case. So you can add teams and users, and you can say this is specific team or user, for example, they can only deploy an app, or one can only see an app, or read events and logs, or this one can connect a cluster to a framework. So you have a very detailed one so our back is actually managed by Shipa in this case, and it's connected into your IAM of choice. Now, when it comes to catch, then you still have to do RBAC directly in your cluster, because catch is just the deployment component. I hope that helps a little bit on the answer.
Yeah, at least it does to me. And let's see if it doesn't to them, to Jose. But when you get a chance, just send me those 4 links and those slides, and we'll post it on the meetup so people can access them. And yeah, if you could share your slide deck as well on SlideShare or something like that.
Yeah.
Send me a link, and then we'll post it on the meetup as well.
Of course.
People can, when they look at the video, when they go back and review the video on YouTube, they could match the slide deck to what you were talking about.
Yeah, of course. So when I do that, folks, feel free to steal the little cartoons. I stole it from someone on Reddit, so just keep pushing that so people understand the reality that many of us go actually through when we're implementing this thing. So feel free to steal it away and use as you wish. I just try to hide the small piece there so people don't feel offended. But that's what goes in our heads.
It's not called steal. It's called borrow.
Exactly. Agree.
Let's see. Does anybody have any other questions you'd like to talk about? Anything related to Kubernetes or to the Shipper product? Let's see here. We got another question here.
How do you integrate into CI/CD and testing? Sure. Sorry, Mike. Can I share the screen for 1 second?
Yeah, I'm going over there.
That's a good question. And another question that I get asked: yes, I use Microsoft Edge, and yes, it is better than Google Chrome. We can get into that discussion in the chat, but it's better. Just go for it. So one example is, I have a sample repo here. Let me just make this bigger. In this case, it's GitHub Actions. But at the end here of the process, it's actually running a deployment process. One of the things I do before running the deployment, I just set up the Shippa CLI. So during my CI process, I basically install the Shippa CLI and I connect to my Shippa instance. And then I do a deployment of the image that my CI built. And I do that using either a kind of a straight deployment or I do a canary deployment. But that's how you actually integrate into your CI. And you can do not only the deployment piece, but you can also create frameworks. You can bind clusters. You have full control of everything directly from your CI. So you can fully automate it from a GitOps perspective. So if everything goes down on Earth and you lose all your clusters, later when you run your on your pipeline, you can recreate and redeploy everything. So and Catch is the same thing as well. You can just set up the CLI and run the deployment from there.
Let's see here.
By the way, I just saw in the comments.
Not Safari.
That Safari, come on! I didn't even know Safari was still a thing. I won't answer to that, to be honest.
Uh-oh. Yeah, let's see if anybody. We have a few more minutes to kill. If anybody have any other questions.
If you want to talk about guitars, anything.
Jamming,
how that actually fits into Kubernetes and your CI/CD pipeline. Happy to talk about it as well.
I know we have a couple of people here from Latin America, from Uruguay, from I think Mexico as well.
Nice. I look forward to going back to Mexico as soon as this thing is all done. Love the place. I'm still trying to convince my wife to move down there.
Uruguay is a lot of development as well. They do a lot of development.
That's true. That's true. But that's the thing. I want to go to Mexico because I just want to stay by the beach. I don't want to do development. So.
With the guitar.
With the guitar, exactly.
There you go. Okay.
I agree. I agree, my friend. The only problem is that most people don't find it in the music I make. So I usually create problems with the music I make. But no, I agree. I agree.
Anything else anybody else wants to ask here? Let's see.
I agree. I agree with Ilya. Yeah. In Cancun.
Oh, don't even start the Cancun joke.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah, don't even get us started on that. But let's see if anybody else has any questions about Kubernetes. How are people? Is anybody that's listening to us or watching us? Is anybody deploying Kubernetes in production? What kind of issues are you seeing with Kubernetes in production?
I think that's an awesome question. And the other question as well is how far in the process are you, right? Kind of maybe the first few services, or are you dozens or hundreds of services? Right. That's one thing that we've always tried to talk to people about and understand where they are in their journey.
Let's see if somebody wants to share. Give it a few minutes for people to type it in.
And while they're doing that, I won't mention names so I don't put people on the spot, but I'm getting messages on my phone already about Safari being better than Edge.
Oh! Yeah, no need to name calling here.
No. But I'll do some blocking.
But they have to prove it to you.
I'm getting some articles already here on my phone. I have some blocking people to do after this meeting.
So who's going to raise their hand and say that they're, let's see. I got something here.
That's a good question. I think and the way I'll answer that is the worst possible way, which is it depends, right? And I hate when people give me that answer, and I hate giving people that answer as well. I see folks with one single cluster in production with a huge amount of nodes and a huge amount of workloads in a single cluster. But what I'm seeing the most now is even those people migrating over to smaller clusters. And the reason is for them to build kind of better isolation and minimize the blast radius. So if there is something that goes wrong within one of the services in that cluster, it doesn't affect everything else. So at least personally, I'm seeing more and more folks having smaller clusters rather than one large cluster and manage a really complex RBAC scheme and services and so on. But yeah, having large clusters and a lot of services is still real. Personally, I'm seeing more people migrating more towards smaller clusters, smaller apps, less blast radius or smaller blast radius in that case. The service mesh with Shippa in this case, Mike, can I bug you once again, if you don't mind? And in the Shipa dashboard, for example, one of the things we have, it's called network policies, right? And that interfaces directly with your ingress controller that is sitting in your cluster. Today, so it's, for example, doesn't matter if it's traffic or if it's Istio, for example, you build the network policy and the mesh at the application level, we say, and then we translate it down to the CNI that you have, Calico, for example, or using Istio and so on, in a way that when you come here, you can say, for example, this is my booking service that I deployed, and I want to build a rule for my API gateway. So in this case, I come in here and I say the rule is called API gateway, some description. And I'm going to say only the API gateway service or app that I deploy can connect to my booking service on port 3000 for ingress. And for egress, for example, I can allow my booking app to reach out to an external Mongo. And this is the IP for my Mongo database, for example. And it can only send data to my payment service app. So you can build this at an application layer level, because one of the things we hear a lot is service mesh is awesome and people are exploring that, but it becomes really hard to consume after a while, and especially at scale. So when you build this over here with Shipa, you build at the app layer level, and then if you're using Istio, for example, underneath in your cluster, then Shipa translates that down to Istio, and it basically generates these level of visibility for you across both ingress and egress. I hope that answers a little bit.
I don't know. Enrique is a friend of mine from Uruguay. I don't know if that answered your question, Enrique.
So it is out of the box with Shipa. You just need an ingress in your cluster, and we don't force the ingress that you're using, because we like giving the DevOps team freedom of choice. If they want to use Istio versus traffic, it's the DevOps team choice. Shipa just sits on top and controls whatever you have, but the functionality of building the mesh, it's out of the box on Shipa.
Gotcha. Yeah, that kind of makes sense there.
I don't know, this Kubernetes thing is too big. Sometimes it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, he says it does. So awesome. Anybody else have any more questions? Nobody's answered the question about doing Kubernetes in production.
That's right. That's right.
And I'm trying to see. I'd like to see that answer. If anybody out there that's still connected and listening to us, tell us. Share with us how your experience has been with deploying Kubernetes in production, and how far have you gone into it. Enrique says it's great. So Enrique helps a lot of customers in Uruguay. So he helps them with the deployment and stuff like that. So
nice.
So
nice.
Let's see. Jose. Okay, let's see what Jose has to say.
So good question. So yeah,
tough ones there.
It is. Okay, so I'll show the screen again. Very good point. It creates a Shipa for the booking service. It creates a Shipa.cloud. That's the default. And this is actually sitting on top of a GKE cluster, actually. So it creates that endpoint even on top of your cloud provider load balancer. Now, you don't need to use this only. If you want, you can basically do a Shipa CNAME add, for example, and you can add a CNAME to an application. So later you can say app1.google.com, as long as you own the domain and the DNS management. You can add a CNAME app1.google.com, and if you want it to be HTTPS endpoint, basically you can just add for example, I can say, or maybe booking app.google.com, for example. And then I would say it's for my booking service. And then I'll say encrypt. So it connects to your Istio in your cluster. It generates the certificate, and it creates the entry, the CNAME entry for the app. So your app can be reached on booking-app.google.com. The only thing you need to do is you need to go into your DNS management and add a CNAME pointing here, pointing to Shipa or your app endpoint. And your app will respond to that in HTTPS with certificates automatically generated. But even if you're using load balancers from Google Cloud, AWS, which is my case, I'm using GKE in this case, it does create by default your app name.shipa.cloud.
Great questions.
I agree.
Anybody else before we end this call tonight? And anybody wanting to revisit? Hold on a second here. Custom domain like this.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, anybody wanting to review this talk tonight, it'll be on our YouTube, scrolling at the bottom of the screen where it says the meetup video is available on the youtube.com/users DevOps Live, and you'll find the video there. It's basically the same link that is in the meetup. So, you could always go back and see it from the beginning. And then I'll work with Bruno on getting the SlideShare SlideShare link, and because from the SlideShare link that you provide the presentation, they could always go to the last slide and look at the 4 links that are in there that you shared out. So
agree, and again, especially for Catch, it's an open source project.
Right.
Would love to see your love to the project, as well as if you want to contribute and participate, either with pull requests or ideas, or using. Would love to see that. One question I think I saw folks asking as well is how Shipa affects the cost management in the cloud.
That's a good question.
It is a great question, because we see a lot of people over provisioning Kubernetes clusters, and they sit there for a long time and they're overpaying for that. We had the plan of doing some cost management at the beginning, but we backed out of it, unfortunately. The reason is especially because we target, when we were targeting and talking to large organizations, they don't usually pay the rate card that smaller organizations they pay. They usually have an agreement with AWS or Google. They have a different type of service and cost, and these do not get reflected into what you can get with the API. So it creates that mismatch in a way that Shipa would provide and say, you're spending $1,000 per cluster. But then in reality, finance is actually spending $200 because they have an agreement with Google.
They got like a bulk rate.
Exactly. So because it was risky for us to provide the wrong information, we chose not to provide that. And it's better to get that directly from the cloud provider in that case.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Well, if nobody else has anything else to add or any other questions, I don't see any questions. I'll leave it with the last thought here.
I completely agree.
Yeah, don't let your friends manage Kubernetes alone.
I agree.
Okay. Well, thank you, Bruno. It was a pleasure you coming on and talking to us tonight, doing the demos. I think the demos are the most useful. Usually people get things out of. Let me see this. It looks like there's one more comment here. Oh, there's one more here.
A good question. So from a Shippa cost consumption model is on a per user base. It works on a user seat on a monthly cost. So it's like you pay for Datadog or New Relic and these guys. So it's a monthly fee per user in that case, user seat.
Yes. And we got another one there.
Good question. That's a good question. So we don't support all the ingress configurations yet, for example, and all of the configurations, including circuit breaker strategy or introducing failure points and so on, because it's a lot to abstract. So what we do is we try to map 90% of the common things that people use all the time. And those are the things where we started abstracting away. Now, if you want to go and inject fault injection, circuit breakers, and others, Shippa does not block you from using your Kubernetes cluster, your Istio, and everything directly. You still have control over it. It's different than a PaaS, right? A PaaS, once you install a PaaS, that's whatever the PaaS offers you, that's it. You cannot go and do anything. So things that are not included in Shippa yet, you can go directly to Istio and inject things that you want into your pods. And what we say is, if even after your apps are deployed, if you take Shippa away from that, your apps are still going to be running. So for those things that are not there yet, you still have total control for doing whatever you need to achieve your goal.
Gotcha. Great questions. Okay, well, everyone, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next month, I guess.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Bruno.
Thank you, Mike, for having me. I appreciate it, and thanks everyone for the comments and the time.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
All right.